Xiaoyu Pu, it's October 19, 2023. Welcome to BRI Dialogues.
My pleasure.
I wanted to start with this topic and concept that I'm sure you've heard about this element of deep pluralism and the role of China and the growing ambitions of China. And what better time now than the 10th anniversary of BRI and the Belt Road Initiative, which was just BRI Forum just a day or two ago as well in China. Where is this deep pluralism coming from? Take us a bit about China's take on defining a new, I wouldn't call it a world order, but a new multipolarity and centricity that everybody feels welcome. Can you take us through that?
Okay. So the BRI, another international forum, just concluded in Beijing. I think maybe it's also a moment for reflection, both in China and abroad. BRI certainly have made a lot of progress and achievement, emphasizing infrastructure building, collectivity, and all kinds of projects. And also the Chinese government now seems to try to upgrade the program. But on the other hand, I think is that it's a very successful domestic mobilization to demonstrate, but also it also tried to project a vision that maybe China can play a more active role in economic development, in shaping global governance, and in providing some sort of alternative voices in global order. And I think regarding that is pretty successful. But I have seen that there are also potential problems. Maybe the Chinese leaders, the government, they don't mention much about that. But as a matter of fact, China's economy now is facing a lot of challenges. I think going forward, BRI in the long term still rely upon sort of some of China's domestic growth, but also in partnership with other countries, especially developing countries.
Xiaoyu, thank you for that. Yes, we're all marking the 10 years of BRI. President Xi Jinping was very vocal in Beijing at the forum about its successes and future. But even there, it was very clear that the levels of investment are beginning to taper. And also choice of construction projects are much more selective than what they were 5 years before COVID pandemic, certainly. So what is motivating this change in China's tune? Is it for domestic purposes, as you say, because of the economic slowdown, or is China more aware of the tensions that BRI might be generating overseas?
Interesting question. My own observation is that actually from maybe 5 years or even earlier, like around the year 2016, 17, there were some sort of interesting debates in China's foreign policy community. The idea was a debate about so-called strategic overstretching. That traditionally this was a problem for empires, established superpowers, but China as a rising power, some strategic thinker, they also concerned that maybe China, like a rapidly growing presence worldwide, that could cause a problem very similar to historical empires or superpowers that they overstretched. I think there were some kind of voices in China calling for more caution. That was like almost like 7 or 8 years ago. So that kind of voices, my own observation, interact with policymakers' concerns about a lot of practical problems in the implementation of BRI. So So I think from there, we might see like the Chinese government now is a little bit more cautious regarding the number of projects, and also they also highlight BRI need to upgrade it further. So now they emphasize not just the number of projects, but more about the quality, right? So I think there are all kinds of rethinking about BRI.
Absolutely, you're right. We can see this now emerging, these debates. But so there are 130 countries represented at the forum in Beijing, all of them obviously wanting a bit of China's attention. Sitting in Beijing, given that China knows all these countries are now looking to China to bail them, how does Beijing prioritize? What are the strategic choices that policymakers have to look to prioritize their next BRI investment? Is it a geographical one? Is it on the basis, as you say, qualitative? Is it on the basis of partnership, strategic partners? How does China decide where not to go and where to invest in?
I think maybe my own observation, it could be some kind of combination of different factors. So diplomatic, strategic, definitely, but also economic efficiency, quality of projects. I think it's might be a sort of overall evaluation of different projects. Definitely Pakistan might still be a big focus, right? So I think then think about the Latin America, Middle East. So I think that's also stretched to other regions. Definitely there's some other new platform like BRICS. So and BRICS now has expanded. So some of the emerging new BRICS countries might also be very active part of the BRI. So definitely the European countries now to some degree are restored, right? So I think the Chinese government might rethink about these different factors. I'm not sure it's like only one factor or only like politics or economy. Actually, I think it's definitely will be a combination of both politics and economy.
Yeah, that's when we're talking about BRICS Plus in particular, and Argentina now added and all of that. But in the heartland and in Eurasia, you have these two massive emerging developing economies. China still calls herself as a developing economy.
Developing country?
Developing country, which is in more ways than one, debated out there. But how do you see this tango of competition between China and India? And given that India resides in both BRICS Plus and SCO, what are the major obstacles that you think that would arise in China's ambitions and the posturings of India in these two clubs? Is it going to be as smooth as it has been so far? Or do you anticipate some challenges there? And I want to cap that with another question, just like my naughty co-host Anush here, and add one more question to it. Would you see and envision in our lifetimes, on the same conversation, a non-aggression pact between Russia, India, and China?
Okay. So, I mean, you can clarify the non-aggression pact similar to what? So you mean?
Basically that India and China arrived to a point that they put their border disputes, their military posture as, an entente, and, they come together and they understand that they're not a threat to one another. How could that unlock the potential in Eurasia and heartland at large? And then till we get there, how can India scupper the ambitions of China in both SCO and in BRICS Plus?
Okay, yeah. So China-India relationship is very complicated, very complicated. So let me highlight a few points. Number one, definitely the relationship is shadowed by the border dispute for several decades. So it's so difficult because the disputed territory is very large, even though not many people live there. But it's a very large disputed territory, and also this disputed territory also shaped by historical memory of conflict and also nationalism in both sides. And so all these factors make makes the resolution of the border dispute extremely difficult. What we can hope in the foreseeable future is not like a easy absolute resolution of the border dispute, maybe some sort of management. That's exactly what happened in the past several decades, even though there are rising tensions, but the two sides have largely managed the border dispute, despite, I mean, some kind of occasionally problems, tensions. That's so number one is border dispute. In my own research, I highlight these kind of status competitions and a status dynamic between the two countries. Both India and China are large countries. Initially, they had a competition about the leadership role in the global south. That we can see history in the early 1950s. So the status competition between China and India has a long history. So this kind of status concern, they do shape the relationship. Even Prime Minister Modi in 2015, he visited China, made a speech at Tsinghua University. He even highlighted like some kind of status issue between the two countries. He said that if China accommodate India's aspiration in some sort of like a UN Security Council and other big power club, the relationship will move forward dramatically. So even at the highest level, the status is a big factor between the two countries. But number three, I also want to highlight is that because sometimes China, India, they overestimated the competition between the two countries. This is partially because the relationship is asymmetrical.
Right.
China is more powerful than India, given all kind of indicators. That means there's asymmetry of not only power and status, but also asymmetry of attention and perception. That means for China, their number one concern is always about the United States. Chinese policymakers, even Chinese experts, they don't pay enough attention to India. Right. So to some degree, India is more sensitive to China's action, and China is less sensitive. So that this kind of asymmetry of power and perception created some kind of scenario that China is not sensitive enough about the Indians' concerns, but the Indians sometimes might overreact. So Indian policymakers or even some foreign policy elites or even the public, they might interpret China's actions as sort of design a strategy to contain India. But a lot of policy decision, Beijing might, we just make the decision, we consider all kinds of factors. But in India, easily we interpreted all those decisions, this is another strategy to contain India. So number one, border dispute. Number two, status competition. Number three is asymmetric relationship. All these contribute to the problem in the bilateral relationship. Yeah.
Xiaoyu, you are my kind of guest, because before I even articulate the question, you're already providing the answers. So that's absolutely brilliant. You're right. I mean, that analysis is spot on. So let's take India's own thinking out of the equation for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
We see that the West is now beginning to bank and invest in India's emergence as a counterweight to China, whether it is in terms of high-tech industries, whether in terms of opening up their own industries to India, whether in terms of diversifying their investments away from China into India, and also, last but not least, this latest IIW road through to UAE, Saudi Arabia, into Europe. So India itself is, in a sense, being objectified by the West. That must be of concern to Beijing, given that actually the level of dialogue between Delhi and Beijing, as you said, is rather low, that they don't seem to be able to connect at the same level, irrespective of being members of these two big organizations, SCO and the BRICS. So how do you think the West's interventions in this asymmetrical relationship is going to affect the bilateral relations between India and China?
Yeah, I think to some degree, the West has upgraded, especially the United States, I should emphasize, has upgraded its so-called strategic relationship with India. That's not new. I mean, even far before Biden, Trump, even before Obama, that largely started from the Bush administration, W. Bush administration. So as sort of a potential counterbalance vis-a-vis China, it's a classical balance of power politics. That's for sure. And the implication is that does add some new factor in China-Indian relationship. In a sense that to some degree, Indian leaders or policymakers might use this kind of Western partnership as not only as a counterbalance vis-a-vis China, but also maybe as some sort of additional factor to attract China's attention, right? So I mentioned earlier that Beijing might not be sensitive enough to Indians' concerns. Now India might say, you see, you are not show your enough concern. Now I have powerful friend. So to some degree, that does add to some degree some sort of concerns, at least the debate in China. My own observation, some Chinese international experts, foreign policy advisors, they are debating to some degree the India-US partnership is already a done deal, in a sense that some expert, maybe hardline expert, would advocate that, okay, India will follow US, that's it. So no matter what, China cannot win back. But others might disagree. Others say, oh, it's exactly the United States now is upgrading partnership with India. China need to do more to accommodate India's concerns, maybe to not entirely move India back, but at least prevent India from further their strategic partnership with the United States. So to some degree, I think that kind of partnership with the West, with the United States, adds some new factor in China-India dynamics.
Yeah, when we look at the posturing of China and India in some of these recent crises, there is a clear contrast. In case of Ukraine and the war between Russia and Ukraine, India is pretty much to the T following China's model, with one difference that China came out and said this is a no limit partnership verbally. But in terms of trading in energy and dealing with Moscow, diplomatic relationship, the position in UN, China and India are exactly the same. When it comes to the latest crisis in Israel and Palestine in the past 2 weeks, and this sad tragedy that is unfolding in front of our eyes, China is taking a different pivot here, and India is taking a different pivot. India is more on the Western side of the assessment of the root causes of this crisis, whereas China is a little bit more in the global South camp in assessment. How do you perceive these posturings? Is this again one path of accommodation of India in that retaining that attention with the United States? Or is it a tactical pivot? And how will this again influence that cohesion and coherence in the SCO at large when we're moving forward?
Yeah. I think first let's briefly talk about the Ukraine crisis and Indian-China position. There, I agree. They are the two countries. Their position are very, very similar. But I should emphasize they are neither in joining the West on the Ukraine side or on the Russian side. Each of these big countries on their own side. So that they make a very self-interested calculation. On the one hand, they need some kind of partnership with Russia for similar or different reasons, including, right, in case of India, that's the long-term arms trade with India, imports from imports from Russia. So I think they need some sort of like partnership with Russia, but also they understand the UN Charter, sovereignty, and the sentiment from the global South. So they need that kind of, and also they need some sort of manage their relationship, also consider perspective from the European countries and the United States. So that's a really like a reflection of these kind of different factors. So India and China ultimately have made a very similar decision to sort of their position. I'm not saying it's like entirely neutral. Let me put maybe some sort of like pro-Russia neutrality. Some people talk about that. So that's for that Ukraine crisis. And regarding the Israel-Palestinian or Israel-Hamas conflict, obviously China's position is sort of like reflect China's long-term support to Palestinians' struggle in the Middle East. But also China has a relative friendly and cooperative relationship with Israel as well. But overall, China's rhetoric, diplomatic action reflect that this is like a long-term political problem. We need to think about this politically, diplomatically, rather than just to think about all the immediate violence attacking civilians. That's wrong on both sides, right? So China definitely condemn violence against the civilians on both sides. But China looked like the diplomatic reflection or position reflect their long-term sort of position that this is a political problem. We need to think about it politically, diplomatically in the long term. India, to some degree, emphasized anti-terrorism, solidarity in primarily or almost entirely with Israel. Maybe that reflect India's partnership with Israel, maybe the stronger partnership with the West. But I also am wondering that could also be a factor. The Indian government, the Modi government, they have a very strong anti-terrorism position. So to some degree, they see Hamas and some of the like Muslim terrorist attack in India as some sort of similarity, although it's totally different reason. But I can guess that kind of anti-terrorism campaign or attitude, that might be a factor in Indian government's calculation as well. That was not a factor in the Chinese position, maybe.
Yeah, again, fascinating analysis you provide for us, Xiao. But interesting, of course, in the United Nations, we saw this kind of disentangle when it came to discussion in the Security Council. They couldn't even agree on a ceasefire, let alone find a way forward. And China is a permanent member of the Security Council. You can see the dilemmas that these countries are facing. Staying on Ukraine for a moment, so I often wonder which country, China or India, benefits from a much weakened Russia. Assuming that Russia will remain weak for the next decade, no matter what happens in the war, there are material advantages that China can gain, but also a lot of disadvantages if China loses this backbone that it has in Eurasia. From your perspective, which of these two countries worries more about a much weakened Russia, India or China? And how will they address this, do you think? I know it's an unfair question, but it's the one that I often think about myself. So I'd love to have a learned response from you.
Oh, okay. So it's a let me put this way. It's hard to quantify. I mean, who I worry more. But let me just briefly say that China, on the one hand, does not support Russia's military aggression against Ukraine. That has violated every fundamental international norms, especially UN Charter and sovereignty. So even today, China has not recognized any of Russia's annexation of Crimea. So even today, China has never officially. So I think that should be clear. But on the other hand, China wants Russia to remain as a reliable sort of partnership. That's for a number of reasons. Number one is that for global balance of power. Obviously, since 1990s, Chinese leaders openly talk about multipolarity. China does not like this kind of unipolar system. So if Russia is dramatically weakened, China does not like that. I should say, especially maybe Chinese government does not want to see the Russian government is to collapse. I think that for sure. So I mean, even I remember when Xi Jinping visited Russia this spring, they had a joint statement. They put the language there openly. They say Russia, the language, I forgot the exact word, but something like Russia welcome a prosperous China, China welcome a strong Russia, or something like that. So I think for balance of power politics, China really want Russia not to be defeated. But again, China did not or does not support the military action itself. And also for India, I can see there's some similar maybe attitude, in a sense that even though now India has upgraded its partnership with the United States, but there are important limitations regarding the partnership. So India and the United States, they have a long-term distrust, get back to Cold War era. So I don't see they overcome that kind of distrust entirely. So from India's perspective, they really want a multipolar world. For India, either unipolar, like US dominant, or US-China dominant bipolar system, that's not their ideal scenario. So for India's perspective, a multipolar world will give India more leverage to maneuver in the global state, on the global stage. So I would say for both China and India, they don't want to see Russia to be entirely defeated, to be dramatically weakened. But on the other hand, neither country really supported Russia's military action. Yeah.
Xiaoyu, thank you for that. And talking about the posturing and the ambitions, the latest development was this India, Middle East, Mediterranean, Europe economic corridor. And with this latest crisis, that basin of Mediterranean is in question, of how prolonged this crisis in Hamas, Israel can take, and what's going to happen. At the same time, you have the middle and northern corridor because of the war in Russia and Ukraine. So BRI is facing, on one side, a competition that just started, but it's blocked. And some of her own paths are blocked. Going back to the very question that Anush raised in the beginning, will that push China to look into Latin America more? And with the pushback from Europe, and go after small is beautiful. And now that the United States is removing some of the sanctions and providing some opening space to countries like Venezuela, would you see BRI going into those directions, as short as that may be, because of keeping oil in low prices for the next year election? But do you see that China will look more strategically in Latin America with these challenges on the BRI path?
Yeah, to some degree, that could be one potential direction, in the sense that, as I mentioned earlier, when Beijing now is rethinking, re-examining the BRI program overall, they do consider all the geopolitical tension, the problems in the Middle East, and the Russian-Ukraine war that really have a very negative impact for the BRI in the Eurasia region. So that's dramatically increased the geopolitical risk of many of these programs. So to some degree, region like Africa, Latin America, they don't have a similar kind of problem. Of course, they have their own domestic, regional challenges on their own, but their challenges might be different. So to some degree, BRI originally, remember, it primarily some kind of regional focus, right? Primarily Eurasia. But now BRI is already become a global program. So to some degree, China has invested in Latin America for almost like 2 or 3 decades. So China has become the largest trading partner for many, at least several Latin American countries, including Brazil and other big economies in Latin America. So I can imagine the BRI in Latin America will going forward. I think, given the some sort of geopolitical rising tensions in Eurasia region. Yeah.
One quick question before Anush jumps in. In light of these crises, do you think China is having the itch and the urge to participate in brokering a sort of solution and a peace between Israel and Palestine? Or because United States, in the eyes of the Muslim world and the Middle Eastern countries and the Arab world, is not in a position to do that. Do you think China will be audacious, bold, or I would say adventurous enough to even embark on this, or it's out of the question?
I think if you ask me this question 20 years ago or 15 years ago, my answer would be absolutely no, not in involvement. Because at that time, Chinese foreign policy guiding principle was Deng Xiaoping's low-profile approach. Don't be involved in any big trouble outside of East Asia. That was the guiding priority. But now I think China already deeply involved globally. So to some degree, also Xi Jinping has pursued a much more proactive foreign policy. So I can imagine China is willing to play a much more active role already. So I think traditionally we only see, okay, China's relationship with Middle East Arab countries primarily in sort of like energy lens of framework of economic business. But in the past 10 years, China has invested some sort of dialogue, discussions about the security and the diplomatic political framework. So I think China is willing to play a more active role. And also, as Ali, your point is exactly important. To some degree, even the United States is much more powerful in terms of military, diplomatic influence worldwide. But the US position is to some degree too biased, too one-sided. That's to some degree is counterproductive. And to some degree, China is positioned, even though to some degree very sympathetic to Palestinian people, but also, as I mentioned, China has maintained good relations with Israel for decades. So China's position actually is slightly more neutral. That diplomatically put China in a better position to help negotiate, even though, as I said, the US is militarily, diplomatically more influential, but the US position is a little bit too biased regarding this particular conflict. Even many American experts like Professor Stephen Walt recently wrote several articles criticize America's position and emphasizing the one-sided position is not helpful. I think China actually has some diplomatic advantage, right? Like think about Iran versus Saudi Arabia, and Israel versus Palestinian, Ukraine versus Russia. They are rivals or even enemies, but both these different pairs of rivals, China is friendly to both. So I think that put China in a better position in a relative sense.
Perfect answer to what would have been my question, Xiaoyu. Do you think, though, that there is a danger China would spread itself too thinly, that actually it may not have the staying power like the Western countries have had to sustain the long-term engagement that these conflicts require in order to see through to fruition? That actually that is what is making Beijing cautious, that it does not want to let all of its diplomatic capital be spent in a cause that it knows it cannot resolve successfully. So that makes it to be much more cautious, which damages, of course, its medium-term image of a peacemaker. So how do you think China manages this dilemma?
Yeah. Okay, interesting question. So although, let me clarify, although I emphasize China under Xi Jinping might be more proactive in diplomacy, but the traditional emphasis of this kind of low profile approach, that's still an important voice in China. In a sense that to some degree, my own observation is that regarding like Ukraine crisis and other problems, China's sort of the official position sometimes in somewhere between, on the one hand, it's a sort of like a leading role or more sort of co-leader role. Like China cannot solve the problem in single-handedly. Maybe China want to build partnership with European countries and other big powers to help deal with problem multilaterally. That's a co-leading role. But the other kind of role of China is what I observe is kind of shirker role. Try to avoid get involved. So I have seen that official rhetoric from Beijing frequently change from sometimes like want to be more active, want to mediate, want to be a leader or co-leader in dealing with the problem. Other times, the emphasis is, okay, China is not a direct part of the conflict. You guys should not blame China. So that's, I think it's also like even the Ukraine crisis, if you observe China's diplomatic statement, sometimes they emphasize, oh, we want to play a role, more active role. Other times, oh, this is not our problem. You guys should not, nobody should blame China. You blame the wrong person. So that kind of, I can see this kind of contradictory narrative and a position will continue in the coming years.
Tell you, we're really enjoying having you on the program, and that element of this hybrid approach is very interesting, and that begs the question: in an ever-changing position of China that you just touched on, in an ever-changing fluid landscape of global diplomacy, crises, if you were to leave our audience on both sides with the cinephobes and the cinephiles with one piece of advice, what would be that advice to each of those cohorts?
I want to emphasize is that really China is not a monolithic nation. Even its political system is over a one-party system. Somebody even mentioned, oh, it's now a one-man system. But behind the government system, I mean, it's a huge country. It's a dynamic society. It's not a monolithic. Regarding foreign policy, regarding economic policies, there are lively debates. There are all kinds of different ideas. So I think the global community, either like a China hawks or China doves or whatever, need to hear different voices from China. We need to get facts in a more nuanced way. China is a real country. It's not a like an abstract sort of a concept that can easily be summarized. But also I want to emphasize China is very contradictory. If you find any contradictory from China, that's exactly the reality in China. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely wonderful. It's been a joy to be hosting you today with us, Professor Pu, particularly with the way in which that you've navigated through the rocks that Ali and I have been putting in your way. You're leaving with the impression that actually the world is changing, that there are no great power has got all the strings in his hands to pull to make other countries do what it demands, and therefore the arena is open for countries like China, like countries like India, to begin to assert themselves for a much more of a plural international order. But what you leave me behind with, though, is this thought that in Beijing and New Delhi, both of these largest countries on the planet know this reality. They are neighbors. They share Asia between them, and yet they don't seem to grasp the importance of a partnership in the interest of humanity rather than competition in the interest of their own narrow-based so-called national interest. You've explained the proximity of views between them over the Middle East, over the Ukraine crisis, over the United States, over pathways and so on. And yet they're unable to bridge this gap. For that reason alone, we need to have you back again so that you can help us understand how we can pick at this tension between them, this lack of trust between them, to make sure that if heart of Asia is stable, then Eurasia can be stable. And once Eurasia is stable, the rest of the world can settle down. So we can't thank you enough for having opened our eyes to so many interesting parallels of discussions. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah.